Hey everybody, this is David. Today I would like to talk about another blog post that's been very influential on me in terms of my thinking about community. And that blog post is called The 99-1 Rule for Participation, Inequality in Social Media and Online Communities by Jakob Nielsen, which was published in 2006. And I'm just going to put the screen right here so you can see the key bits. So essentially, what he's saying is that in all online communities, he does not provide any exceptions to this. That if you have a large community, let's just say it's more than a couple hundred people, that's going to break down into 90% lurkers, 9% intermittent contributors, and 1% heavy contributors. Now, when I first saw this, it kind of blew my mind. He later on in the article basically backs this up with data and talks about a number of studies that have been done ever since, Usenet in the 1990s. But it blew my mind because it made so many things click and make sense to me. When I am in a number of communities, one of the things that you hear people moan about a lot is there's too much work for too few hands. So if you're a member of a local club, I don't know, let's just say it's watercolor painting in the park on Sundays, you'll find that there's always a small number of people who are doing all of the work. And there might be lots of people who are coming to benefit from that work. But it's always the same five people that the tasks fall to. And in open source communities, one of the common things you'll hear is that we need to recruit more people to help us out. Stop reporting bugs. We need people to actually help us fix the bugs. I mean, you can't have a giant number of people just throwing more work onto the top 1%. Again, like I've heard a lot of discussion in community forums about this being unfair. The top 1% frequently feels like they're having more work pushed on them. In community circles, we would often talk about, well, how do we enable or empower that 9% or some of that 90% to do some of the work themselves? And in open source community building, we always want to draw up the lurkers. We want them to stop lurking. We want them to come out of the shadows and basically post something, ask a question, answer somebody else's question, but do something other than lurk. Still, what we find is that this ratio is sticky and persistent. I mean, basically, like you can think of this as logarithmic. It's not to say that there's no community that doesn't have, 2% of people who are real champions in their community. But you'll never get to 10% champions in a community that's thousands of people in size. The bigger the community gets, the more it tends to seem to revert to this kind of mean. Now, later on in the post, he talks a lot about basically like the early inequality research on the web. And later on, then he goes into the downside of participation inequality. And from my perspective, the main one here is you don't get a diversity of opinions. So when you go into any community, the viewpoints, the culture, the takes that you see are going to be dominated by the loudest people in the community. They are going to have their voice heard simply because they say stuff. It's not that anybody means to exclude the viewpoints of 90% of users, but that is what happens when they completely fall silent. And so the what you hear in a community is the inverted pyramid. So 1% are doing 90% of the postings, and 10% of the postings comes from the next 9%. And then you have this massive iceberg that you never hear from. If you've ever seen this iceberg meme, it's like that. The bit of the iceberg above the water are the people who contribute the most. The bit of the iceberg that's at the water level is that middle 9%, and then the vast bulk of the iceberg is under the water. Never see it, never hear from it. So what this can do is it can lure us into a false sense of understanding of our community. We want to listen to our community. We want to hear what they have to say, but we're always stuck in a situation where we're only hearing from the top 9%, possibly the top 10%, the bottom 90% in terms of their volume. You never hear anything from them. And this creates a lot of problems. He talks about customer feedback, the reviews, politics, search engine, and signal to noise ratio. So basically, you have this confirmation bias that you end up designing your product or your community towards what the loud people want, not towards what everybody wants, but towards what the loud people want. The next section deals with different kinds of skew that can occur here. I'm not going to cover this all that much. This was like one of the most nihilistic, but like, holy crap kind of realizations for me. Every single community that I have ever been in has wanted to overcome this dynamic. And the central finding is here is you can't. You absolutely can't. Um, this kind of sent me down a lot of thinking and research in other areas is basically like the fundamental dynamic here is that it requires an escalating amount of time and commitment in order to get into that 9% and in order to get into that 1%. And as community professionals, I think we're often trying to design things with as low barrier as possible to entry. You want to make it easy to contribute to your community, thinking that you can bend this curve if you do. But no matter how easy you make it to contribute to your community, the unget-aroundable reality is that it takes time. It takes a lot of time for people to contribute in a thoughtful way. And a lot of people simply don't have that time. And no matter how easy you make it, they are not going to do it. That doesn't necessarily have to be a disaster, but but it's a major thing that we have to grapple with in community organizing and in community work is how to create movements or communities where the bottom 90% can get some value or can add some heft or weight or usefulness to the community without placing a lot of demands on their time because those demands are pretty unrealistic. So basically, he talks about how you shape the inequality curve's angle. So, are you going to have a 99-1 distribution, or if it's really hard to contribute to your community, you might have a much steeper decline. Maybe 80-16-4 would be possible. That would kind of be a dream, I think, for most communities of any size. So how can you equalize it? Make it easier to contribute. We talked about this. If it's hard to jump through hoops, then people won't do it. You can make participation a side effect. Now, this is a really smart one. Basically, um, he gives as an example, people who bought this book bought those other books. So if you have a user's activity in the community or their travels basically reflect in their public profile, it contributes data back to the community and they are contributing to the community in a transparent kind of way. Even if it's just with their eyeballs, you might go to questions on a support forum and you might sort or recommend questions in order of how often they've been seen. The passive lurkers are contributing some indication of their interest or intent by telling you what things they're looking at. He says you can edit rather than create. So the blank slate problem is a huge problem in a lot of communities. So this is why, for example, in open source communities, we have the pattern of forking a sample repo or by cloning a sample repo so that I can get started with your library or API by working off of something that I already have. In the JavaScript library community, you would never want to have to set up the full build chain of a JavaScript project yourself. It's just murder, right? You're always going to clone something and start from a not blank slate. Reward, but don't over reward participants. Okay, so this is a thing that in my career and travels, I have referred to as paying your volunteers. And people say, well, they're volunteers, you shouldn't pay them. And I disagree. I think that volunteers are still participating in communities with some desire to um, be rewarded in some way. Typically, that's a psychic reward. That might be being seen well in front of your peers. Having people think that your contributions or your viewpoint matters. That is a form of reward. Um, Money can be good, um, but is, in my view, I think that money is actually fairly destructive to volunteer communities because it takes intrinsic motivation for being a part of the community. It takes their joy or their fandom or their interest, and it turns it into, oh, this is a job. I'm getting paid to do this. And so money is the gold standard extrinsic motivation for doing things. And so you have to be very careful with it because you could actually destroy their intrinsic motivation for doing this. Um, Let's see. Don't give too much to the most active participants, or you'll simply encourage them to dominate the system even more. So, if you're dealing with a top one percenter, you want to give them inducements to keep them happy as a top one percenter. Um, but what if you pushed them really, really hard and you succeeded in pushing them really hard? You could end up with an even more top-heavy ecosystem where only the paladins who make it into the top 1% can take advantage of those rewards, and that's not fun. Finally, promote quality contributors. Um, so this is basically like making sure that what you're rewarding is quality and not quantity. So when you give rewards, you can uh, um, focus on rewarding quality. I don't know how much further I can go into that particular point right now. So basically that is it. I'm going to stop there and I'm just going to leave you with this graphic right here. Um, that basically in all communities, there's a top 1%, there's a middle 9%, and then there's a bottom 90%. And that this actually ties to people's available time and resources to contribute. This can, to some degree, be bent by a community organizer, but a pyramid where you have heavy contributors 50%, intermittent contributors 10%, and then the rest is 40. There is absolutely no data basis in human communities to suggest that that is even possible at scale. This, I think, is a very important frame for how we think about what does it mean to have a good community. This is what a healthy community could look like. This is not a community that is, just taxing the 1%, but this is what they do. So I thought this was a very interesting idea, and it's something that I wanted to contribute to the knowledge base that we're developing. So thank you very much.